Tripp Sullivan, PhD candidate, ethnomusicology, UH Manoa. Dr. Annie Reynolds, arts program assistant, and I'm Eric Chang, arts program coordinator here. It's been a real pleasure, well, for me, working with these two. And we all had our own kind of expertise and perspective to bring to the exhibition. And of course, we couldn't have done it without our consultant, Dr. Ricardo Tremillos, Professor Emeritus, UH Manoa Music Department, Ms. Lynn Martin, and of course, Dr. Michael Schuster, our arts program curator. So for this exhibit, we're just going to kind of pass the mic around and as we tour the gallery, and it won't be a comprehensive tour of the exhibition, but we're going to just point out some highlights that we think everyone should know about. I also want to say that this is a collection that is housed at the University of Hawaii Music Department, and we're grateful for their support over the many years of housing this collection. But it is a living collection in that these instruments are meant to be used. So whether it's by the students or the faculty or the community, this is in effect a lending collection. And in that way, the instruments are not on display. So being familiar with the exhibition, it's wonderful to see these instruments being honored in a gallery space. And we have video as well, so you can see more of the context in which these instruments have historically been performed. So I'm going to pass the mic to Kirk first, and he's going to explain a little bit about the field of ethnomusicology. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. As a representative of the UH Manoa Music Department, I thought it would be right to give you a little insight into how we study music of the world. So to do that, first let me point out that this section, the exhibit is basically organized geographically, and this section represents the Pacific. And we can use some examples from the Pacific to illustrate how we think about this vastly diverse world of music that we're faced with, and that we have thankfully representation of in this wonderful instrument collection at UH. Early ethnomusicologists tried to use the Western orchestra model for classifying instruments, but that quickly broke down since instruments of the world are so diverse, even relative to our own Western orchestral music instruments. So they've come up with 4 categories for instruments, and as you walk around and read some of the labels, you'll see these categories mentioned, and I encourage you to think about them as you look at each of the instruments. So the first category is called idiophone. It means it's a self-sounding instrument. This is an instrument that doesn't have a string to sound, it doesn't have air going through it to sound, it doesn't have a hide like a drum, so it sounds itself. But even within that self-sounding category, there's a great diversity. For example, our ipuheke, the gourd from Hawaii, is sounded by tapping on it or tapping it on the ground, as one example of how you would get an idiophone to sound. But the rattle in the upper left, the ulili, actually has pebbles inside or seeds inside, and those shake, they rattle as you pull a string to spin the gourds. So you can have rattling idiophones, you can have struck idiophones. The To'ere from Tahiti, Tokere from Cook Islands are another example. These slit-log drums. The Maori poi balls are in the case over here, and they are struck together to make that sound. Just some examples of what we call idiophones or self-sounding instruments. The second category is, we call it a membranophone. That's an instrument that makes a sound with a membrane or a hide, such as the Hawaiian pahu. And this pahu is wonderful because it has shark skin on it, which you probably can't tell from looking, unless you look very closely, but when you touch it, you can feel that the surface is rough in one direction and smooth in another direction. So it feels very different from a cowhide. And then maybe my favorite instrument in this glass here is the smallest drum we have on exhibition, the finger drum, kundu from Papua New Guinea. So they can be large, they can be small, sometimes animal hides or other hides are used to sound membranophones. Third category is called chordophone, and that's because it has chords or strings that are generally plucked or bowed to make sound. And I think our only Pacific example on exhibit is the ukulele tucked in the back behind our Tahitian dancer as an example of a chordophone. And the last category we've gone through idiophones, membranophones, chordophones. The last one is an aerophone. Requires air to produce sound, and maybe the Vanuatu lobe flute there wouldn't surprise you as an example of an aerophone. It's an end blown, so it faces away from you as you blow it, not to the side as our more familiar silver flutes of the orchestra. It's called a lobe flute because of those two arms extending at the bottom, which are supposed to represent a shark's jaw. So that one might be a fairly familiar shape to you. Maybe not so familiar is the bull roarer just above it, this wedge on a string that is also considered an aerophone. And that sounds by whipping it overhead in a circle to making a woo, 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 woo sound. And we call those free aerophones because the air is not trapped in a tube or a vessel of any kind. So there's your four categories to think about, the way we think about them at least: idiophones, membranophones, chordophones, and aerophones. I think I'll stop there for now.
Thank you. So when we were developing this exhibition, we wanted to make sure that there were multiple levels and it was accessible to the musician. There was something that musicians would have to walk away with. Non-musicians, it would be accessible for non-musicians, so we really worked with the language to make it accessible for the layperson. So if you're interested in more about the ethnomusicology, we included that as part of the exhibition. So each instrument shows which category it's part of. There's a lot of terminology and music terminology, and so we included a handout here, especially this will be used for our school groups that come through the exhibition, as well as resources for more reading as well. I wanted to point to the two maps that you see. We generally have one map that's at the front, and this map is not intended to represent the area necessarily, but more as a guide for what you'll be seeing in the exhibition and to kind of show it relationally of where things are from and as a guidepost as you travel through the exhibition. And this time we included a special second map, which is the Pacific Island Nations map, to really honor this area of the world and to show it so that it's not just small dots, but it's actually that you can see all of the different island nations in relationship to one another as well, and to really honor that as part of this exhibition as well. So let's move to the next part of the exhibition. The costumes, yes. So you'll see here, and I mentioned earlier that as part of this exhibition, we wanted to include costuming because in the Asia Pacific region, performing arts, including dance, including the theater performance, is also so integrated and integral to the music as well. And so this Tahitian dance costume, as you see, made out of the beautiful natural materials, was gifted or loaned to us by Professor Jane Mulan. And the hand whisks, you can see we worked really hard to make those look like they're in motion by the dancer. We have just a mannequin here, but how could we make it look like it's a dynamic performer? Because the hand whisks in this position in the dance are meant to look like pua or flowers. Anything else? Next.
And I'll just point out these owl, the bamboo panpipes from the Solomon Islands. And you can see from the photo that even at this large size, they're often blown into to make different sounds and melodies. But also these very large ones are often played by slapping a piece of rubber, sometimes a rubber slipper even, over the top to make both a percussive sound and to sound different melodies. So as we move through to this side of the gallery, this is the East Asian region represented. And again, this we have a beautiful costume piece here from Korea. This belonged to a very famous dancer here in Honolulu, Hala Tai-hom. And the dance piece that is referenced on the label that is associated with this type of costume is also shown on the video and is one of the considered one of the most elegant of the classical dances, so you can see that in motion on the video as well. And as a drummer myself, I moved to Hawaii to study taiko drum, that big drum in the corner. I was so happy to see and work with so many different drums of the world and of the region. And I can just say that the chango, this Korean drum here, can produce so many different timbres and sounds, and the rhythmic cycles that are part of the Korean tradition are so elaborate and sophisticated. It's such a pleasure to learn such a deep tradition. You can see the sticks are shown as they would be played if the drummer is seated and facing us. So on the left hand is this bamboo stick with a round wooden knob at the end, and then a long skinny bamboo stick played with the right hand. These two drum skins are of different thickness and tensioned more to the player's right side. So this is the high side here, the drummer's right, and the low side here, the drummer's left, and playing in different parts of the drum skin with these two different types of sticks, with these two different types of skins and tensions, can create really a world of sound that was very impressive to me as a drummer.
While we're in this section of the exhibit, I'd like to point out a couple of things. One is this wonderful Korean flute, side-blown flute, the taegum. And the flute, in addition to finger holes and a hole to blow into, it has another hole that's covered with a membrane, a very thin membrane. And that membrane vibrates as you blow into it and play the instrument. So you get a buzzing sound from the taegum. That silver plate you see there serves to cover and protect that membrane when you're not playing. And even in the course of putting this exhibit together, I looked more closely at the silver plate, which I ignored for quite a while. And it turns out there are very interesting items carved on that plate. They're instruments, actually. And there are 8 instruments there. And through a little research, we pieced together that these are actually 8 instruments representing 8 materials, representing the traditional Chinese way of organizing instruments. Not by how the sound is produced, as we in ethnomusicology think today, but in terms of the material itself. From the left, if I remember, metal and what are they? Metal, bamboo, gourd, clay, stone, silk for the strings, wood, clapper, and I don't think I've missed any. Anyway, so take a look at that. It's a fascinating little microcosm of how you might otherwise organize instruments by the material they're made of. And then the one other item I'd like to draw your attention to, jumping back to the Pacific for a second, is a leaf oboe, punikao it's called, at the top of the case, which is a coconut leaf instrument. And this was made for our Professor Barbara Smith in the 1970s by one of her students from the Cook Islands. It was made by taking a strip of bamboo and obviously winding it into a coil, and you can make a buzzing sound from it. It doesn't have finger holes, so you can't change the pitch very, very greatly. And so I pose a question to you. Does it constitute a musical instrument? Is it sort of sophisticated enough for us to think of it as an instrument, or should we think of it as a toy and not have it in an instrument exhibit? By the way, these coconut leaves start out green and remain green for about 3 days, and so our instrument is no longer usable after a few days. And so does the perishability influence our thinking about it as an instrument that we should pay attention to or not? So I encourage you, as you go around, to think about what constitutes an instrument, what sort of rises to the level. If children are the only ones that play it, is it a legitimate instrument? If there's no great repertoire of music, should we consider it legitimate? In our view, we consider them all instruments, but it's something we're thinking about, I think.
Then one last instrument I wanted to bring to your attention here is the Yangqin, which is called the butterfly harp. It's here on the pedestal. And this would be performed in the same way that a hammered dulcimer is played. So if you're familiar with that, you can see in the front that we have the small pieces of bamboo that it would be performed with. And when we were talking with Professor Smith in preparing for this exhibition, she pointed out that this one is especially interesting because the more contemporary instruments you would see in just a trapezoidal form, and so it has its name, the butterfly harp. And with this example, you can really see that imagery of the butterfly as well included here. And also, as Eric mentioned earlier, the chongo is set up as though you're watching the performer from the back, and that's sort of how we worked this exhibition in terms of how we were kind of working with setting up so many instruments, is always in with the idea of how they would be placed on stage and how you would be viewing it as an audience member. So we'll continue through to the next part of East Asia, moving on to Japan here. Maybe Eric can start us off here.
Okay, so we have some things that may be unfamiliar to most. Here on my left is an example of just one instrument of the Gagaku ensemble, the court music of Japan. This is an ancient music that still continues to be played to this day. And you can see in this photo from the State Archive, Reverend Shamoto Sensei on my left, playing the ryuteki flute, and also with this gakudaiko type of drum. So this is a tacked drum on a wooden barrel, double-headed drum, but in the Gagaku tradition, heavily ornamented, beautifully painted. These are 3 shishi characters that typically called lions, but not lions as we know them. It's the mythical creature that you see danced Lunar New Year just recently in the Chinese tradition, also in Japan, also in Korea, also in Okinawa. So these are the long-standing mythologies that are also represented here. And you can see these leather-covered beetles alongside the drum. And bugaku is the dance tradition that is performed alongside Gagaku music. And because we have an active Gagaku ensemble here at the university, we were able to borrow from Reverend Shamoto Sensei this beautiful bugaku costume that and this gets performed. One of the opportunities we have with an exhibition like this is to just create more awareness of these real gems that exist in the community and in the university, opportunities to witness, experience, see, and hear these performance traditions throughout the year, and also opportunities to learn, especially if you're a UH student. Whether it's Korean dance, you saw Mary Jo freshly performing earlier, She's an instructor at the music department, but through the theater, the Department of Theater and Dance, teaching Korean dance and drumming. And there's also Okinawan dance that's taught in addition to gagaku, in addition to Javanese gamelan that we'll talk about in a moment. So this is a real special thing that exists here in town with concerts, often moon viewing concerts, open air concerts in the courtyard of the music department for full moon, to enjoy the full moon along with this very special sounding orchestra. Some of these other instruments you may be more familiar with. The koto exists in Japan and also down south in Okinawa. This was an instrument that migrated from the northern parts of Japan to Okinawa and is part of the standard Okinawan traditional musical repertoire as well. We have some Okinawan instruments in the case over there covered with snake skin, the kucho, the bowed instrument, and then the most iconic, the sanshin plucked lute. And those instruments probably have their origins in China and in the opposite way migrated up north to through the other islands of Japan and to become the shamisen, this long-necked lute here. And interestingly, the shamisen is covered with animal hide, sometimes synthetic these days, but traditionally cat skin or dog skin, and has a very percussive sound when it's strummed and the skin is struck with the bachi or the plectrum that's pictured to its right. Bachi is also the name of the drumsticks that are used for taiko. So that percussive sound extends to the vocabulary that's used for the plectrum as well.
I'd like to mention just one, what I think particularly interesting instrument in this section, and that's the Taisho koto, this black instrument with Mount Fuji painted on it in the front. It's a fairly modern instrument. It was invented in 1912, and Goto Morita had been familiar with the Japanese koto, obviously, and then studied in Europe and America in the early 1900s, and decided that it would be clever to integrate the typewriter keys with a chordophone similar to the koto. So the way you play this, and this is the exception, I think, in our display here in terms of how the instrument is oriented. This is oriented from the player's standpoint. So you press the typewriter keys down to shorten the string, and then you pluck it on the side to sound the string and sound the note. Maybe a peculiar instrument, but it has taken on. And you'll see what's called a Chinese organ out in the lobby, which is very much similar instrument, but picked up in China and played there. And in Southeast Asia, the instrument has been picked up and played in ensembles. So modern shows a little bit of the ingenuity, human ingenuity and creativity in finding interesting ways of making sound.
I'd just like to ask Rick if you would have anything you would like to add. Not yet. Okay, good bloom. That's a good Southeast Asian answer. Okay, we're gonna turn this direction and we're moving towards our area of South and Southeast Asia. And first we have the sitar and then the pair of tabla drums, which is probably quite familiar to this crowd. And with this set here, we're really representing sort of the basis of Hindustani Northern Indian music, because you need to have the raga and you need to have the tala. You need to have the melody, so we have the melody instrument represented. You need to have the tala, you need to have the rhythm. And then here we have it paired with a photograph of Zakir Hussein, and he was performing as part of an East West Center program just 2 years ago. And then next to that, we see here we have the classical tradition of India, and here we have also side by side with a folk tradition from India, the chow drums, which is very not commonly seen any longer. And so the chow drum would be used in performance, a dance drama performance of the Mahabharata story. And so this was actually from a performance. So after the performers came here in 1975 and performed in Honolulu, they left this drum, and it became part of the instrument collection, as well as 5 of the masks from the production, which is amazing that it's still standing. It was paper mache mainly from 1975, so it's really just such a treasure. It's been and as so many of these other instruments are as well, that have been on the shelves, and it's so beautiful to be able to bring them out and honor them again. So we're going to come around this way to the next area, moving on to a little more Southeast Asia. I'm trying to decide what I wanted to talk about first. Let's look over here. This is the Indonesian gamelan section, we will say. This is quite a small representation of the full ensemble. So the University of Hawaii at Manoa has a full gamelan ensemble that was acquired in 1970 from the court of Yogyakarta due to the work of Rick Camelias and Barbara Smith. Without them, it wouldn't be possible. And what's amazing, at the same time that the instruments came over, one of the first set of full instruments to come at that time, 1970, Harja Susilo, who passed away just a few years ago, he came also in 1970. And so the group was active from that time. I'm going to give them a little shout out that a lot of the same original members are still performing with the ensemble. It's been active for 50 years this year. They're celebrating their 50th anniversary, and in October they're presenting a performance in honor of Professor Smith, in honor of Harja Susilo, in their 50th anniversary of an original traditional wayang performance. So we can look forward to that. You see the photograph here showing the entire ensemble. I believe perhaps up to 30 musicians, including singers. And just a small sampling, you have the kendang, the drummer, who's the leader of the ensemble. You have the melody instruments represented with the ginder. The ginder would be played with 2 hands, and so they're playing the notes, and at the same time they're also damping the note that came before, so that you have a continuous melody. You have the rabab, the spike fiddle represented here. It's a small model, which is really amazing. My husband plays the Balinese version of this instrument, so he helped me put it together. But what's amazing that even in this model, it's a perfect replica that could be played maybe by the finest of hands. And then here we have a very interesting instrument called the sitar, which is an instrument that is actually, it's up on its side now, because with the gamelan instruments, they have 2 full sets of tunings, the pelong tuning and the slendro tuning. And so you have the little feet pedestals here, so when you set it down on one side, you put the feet down, and you can play your pelong tuning, switch ensembles, turn your instrument over, and you have the other tuning as well. And then we have a mask and the beautiful shadow puppets, because the gamelan ensemble is used in performances to accompany those performance forms as well. And now I will turn this way. We're going to say something about Kulintang?
I think probably Kirk would say something first, I'll just add.
Okay.
I'm really cool, I was going to mention the slit log drum, maybe our largest drum here in the corner, Kul from Bali. But this form of drum, and you've seen smaller slit log drums throughout the exhibit, they're used throughout Southeast Asia and Pacific. a large drum like this would hang in a tower and be struck to announce gatherings or weddings or funerals, announcements like that. But well, one thing I will say about Kulintang is it's as you can see, a series of gongs that are tuned, hence the knobs on the top, tuned to a scale, and this particular Kulintang rack is actually built by our Professor Barbara Smith, when she brought a Kulintang set back from the Philippines, but couldn't get the rack on the airplane with her. Luckily, she had a wood shop in her home and carved this herself in the style of the rack that she had seen it on. So.
Yeah, just to say that the gongs of the Kulintang, the large one, we selected gongs for their decoration, so you got an idea that they're all decorated differently. But this is not unusual. A lot of times, it's not a complete set. Two people in one family has two gongs, and somebody else has another, and you just borrow. So that this is typical to have different designs as long as the tuning works. But we set this up just so you can see that. And the little instrument, the Kulintang in front, is actually a instruction instrument, so you can practice on that before you are allowed to play the big Kulintang. Except, of course, you can sort of see that the case is much more elaborate than the regular case. The wings on the side of the large case, which Professor Smith copied, are supposed to represent the cosmological bird, Garuda in Indonesia, but it's called there's something I know. I'll think of it. I just have my CEO. It's the Sarimano, which means the holy bird, I guess. So that's what the wings are supposed to represent. And I should say that is Desiree still here? That's her picture of one of the players. She was here with her baby carriage. I guess she left. Anyway, so she's a local performer here, and she also teaches dance at the dance department at the university. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Is that be okay?
Okay, then if we move down closer, we have two representations of the Philippines. One of the southern Philippines, which is a so-called Muslim area, and that's the Kulintang, and the costume here. And hanging on the wall is instruments which are probably best known by Filipinos. It's called rondalia. It's a stringed instrument ensemble that was introduced to the Philippines during the Spanish occupation or the Spanish colonization of the Philippines, which was 300 years. And so these instruments have Spanish names. The very small one on the left is called bandurria, and the one sort of the small guitar-shaped one is called octarina, and the large one is called bajo de uñas, which if you understand Spanish, it means the bass.